Most people watching Breaking Bad think Gus Fring is scary because he kills people. He runs a chicken restaurant, he smiles, he stays calm, and that calm is supposed to be the whole trick. Critics who study television villains for a living keep pointing at something else entirely, something that has nothing to do with violence at all. In this video, we break down why Gus Fring is the greatest villain of all time. Section 1. The Chicken Man. Nobody suspected. Gus Fring ran the biggest drug operation in the American Southwest for 20 years, and almost nobody who worked next to him ever guessed it. Not his employees, not the police officers who ate his chicken on their lunch break, not the federal agents he handed donation checks to at charity dinners. That fact alone should tell you something about why he stands apart from almost every other villain television has ever produced. Most criminals in these shows get caught because they slip up, get greedy, or lose their temper at the wrong moment. Gus never did any of those things in public. He built a business so clean-looking that the people paid to catch men exactly like him walked right past him for years. His main business was a fried chicken chain called Los Pollos Hermanos, which means the Chicken Brothers in Spanish. By the time the story catches up with him in Albuquerque, the chain had grown to 14 restaurants, spread across New Mexico and neighboring states. That is not a small operation. That is a real company, with real employees, real health inspections, real tax returns, and a real reputation in the community. People loved eating there. It was treated the same way a lot of people treat any well-known regional fast food chain, somewhere between a guilty pleasure and a local point of pride. The restaurant had a motto that employees were trained to say to every customer, something about how delicious food is always cooking, and workers picked up the phone the same way every time, using the exact same greeting no matter which location they worked at. That kind of consistency does not happen by accident. It happens because someone at the top cared enormously about how the business looked, from the outside down to the smallest detail of how a phone call started. Underneath every one of those 14 restaurants sat a much bigger and much darker business. Los Pollos Hermanos was not just a chicken chain. It was the visible half of a money laundering and drug distribution operation that moved product across the border and through the Southwest for 2 decades. Gus also owned an industrial laundry building called Lavanderia Brillante, which is Spanish for bright laundry. On paper, that laundry business looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a large-scale operation that cleaned linens and uniforms for hotels and other companies. In reality, it gave Gus another legal reason to move trucks, workers, and money around the city without raising questions. 2 completely ordinary-looking businesses, a chicken restaurant chain and a laundry company, were doing the heavy lifting of hiding one of the largest drug empires in the region. What makes this even more impressive, if that is the right word for something this cold-blooded, is how far Gus took the image of being a good citizen. He did not just quietly run his restaurants and stay out of the spotlight. He put himself directly into the community, in ways that made him look like exactly the kind of person law enforcement should trust. He gave money to causes around Albuquerque. He made donations to the local Drug Enforcement Administration office, the very agency whose entire job was to find and shut down people like him. He built a personal friendship with the special agent in charge of that office, a man named George Merkert. He sat on the board of a local hospital. Think about how strange that actually is. A man secretly running a meth empire spent real time and real money making sure the drug police liked him personally, and the hospital board trusted him with decisions about the community. He was not hiding in the shadows. He was standing in the light, smiling, shaking hands, and writing checks, because he understood that being visible and likable was the best possible disguise. This is worth slowing down on, because it says something important about what kind of villain Gus actually is. A lot of the criminals in stories like this one try to disappear. They keep their heads down, avoid attention, and hope nobody looks too closely. Gus did the opposite. He made himself impossible to suspect by becoming a person everyone already liked before they had any reason to ask questions. By the time anyone did start asking questions, they were asking about a man who had donated to their office, shaken their boss's hand at fundraisers, and fed half the city chicken for years. That is a much harder wall to break through than simple secrecy. Secrecy makes people curious. A spotless public record makes people stop looking in the first place. The man who almost broke through that wall was Hank Schrader, a DEA agent working the meth cases coming out of Albuquerque. Hank was sharp, and he had a habit of noticing small details that other people missed. At one point during his investigation, Hank starts putting together a theory that Gail Bodeker, a chemist connected to a rival meth operation, would never have gone to a chicken restaurant on his own, since Gail was a vegetarian. Hank reasons that if Gail went to Los Pollos Hermanos at all, it was probably for a meeting, not for the food. That single observation, a man who does not eat meat visiting a chicken restaurant, becomes one of the first threads that starts pulling Gus into the investigation. It sounds like such a small thing, a vegetarian showing up somewhere odd, but that is exactly the point. Gus's entire operation survived on the idea that nobody would notice small things like that, because on the surface, everything about his life looked completely normal. The thread gets pulled even tighter later on, when Hank is looking through evidence from Gail's apartment after Gail is found dead. Among the items collected from the crime scene is a soda cup from Los Pollos Hermanos. When the fingerprints on that cup are checked, they come back matching Gustavo Fring. Hank sits with that discovery, pauses, and lays it out to his colleague like the biggest card in his hand. What is Gustavo Fring's fingerprint doing at Gail Bodeker's apartment? It is a simple question, but it lands like a small earthquake. Because up until that point, nobody in law enforcement had any real reason to connect the friendly restaurant owner, who funds their charity events, to a murder scene tied to a meth chemist, a soda cup. That is all it took to start cracking open 20 years of careful work. It shows just how thin the line was between Gus staying invisible forever and Gus finally being seen for what he really was. It is worth pointing out how strange this must have felt for the people who worked for Gus at the restaurants themselves. Employees like the assistant managers running the counters day to day had no idea what was happening below the surface of their own workplace. They were hired to run a chicken restaurant, and as far as they knew, that is exactly what they were doing. They dealt with customer complaints, cleaned fryers, managed shifts, and followed strict rules about how things were supposed to be done. Rules that came from Gus himself and were followed without question, because Gus expected things to be done exactly his way. Some of those rules probably felt like normal high standards from a demanding boss who cared about his brand. In reality, those same standards, the same obsession with everything looking perfect and predictable, were part of what let a drug empire hide in plain sight for so long. A messy, poorly run restaurant draws attention. A perfectly run one does not. Gus needed his public business to be flawless, not because he loved the chicken business for its own sake, but because a flawless business never gives anyone a reason to look underneath it. The ownership structure behind Los Pollos Hermanos adds another layer to how well protected this operation was. The restaurant chain became a subsidiary of a large German company called Madrigal Electromotive. Having a foreign conglomerate connected to the business gave Gus even more legal cover and more distance between himself and any single point of failure. If local authorities ever looked into Los Pollos Hermanos on paper, they would find a legitimate corporate structure with international ties, not some suspicious standalone company with no real backing. That kind of corporate wrapping, boring as it sounds, is exactly the sort of thing that keeps investigators moving on to easier targets. Nobody wants to spend years untangling international business paperwork chasing a hunch about a fried chicken chain that donates to their own office. All of this points to the same underlying idea. which is that Gus understood something most criminals in his position never fully grasp. Being feared is useful in certain moments, but being trusted is far more powerful over the long run. A feared man draws attention. People whisper about him, watch him, build cases against him, because his name already sounds like trouble. A trusted man gets invited to dinner. A trusted man gets to sit on hospital boards and shake hands with federal agents at charity events. And everyone in the room assumes the worst possible explanation is the last one they would ever consider. Gus built an entire second identity around being exactly the kind of person nobody suspects. And he maintained that identity with total discipline for 2 decades, longer than most criminal operations manage to survive in secret at all. There is something almost unsettling about how ordinary the whole thing looked from the outside. This was not a criminal empire hidden behind armed guards and secret compounds, at least not from the public's point of view. It was hidden behind fry oil, drive-through windows, and a friendly slogan repeated by teenage employees who had no idea what their paychecks were really funding. The most dangerous man in the entire story, for a long stretch of it, was also, as far as most of Albuquerque was concerned, just the nice guy who ran the local chicken place and gave money to good causes. That contrast between how safe and normal everything looked and how much danger was actually sitting underneath it is part of what makes Gus stand out from other villains people talk about. His danger did not come from chaos. It came from control, patience, and a public face built so carefully that even trained investigators needed a fingerprint on a soda cup before they even knew where to start looking. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That fingerprint, though, only tells you that something is wrong. It does not tell you why. It does not explain who this man actually was before he ever opened a single restaurant, or why a soda cup in a dead chemist's apartment connects back to someone the DEA had been quietly trusting for years. To understand that, you have to go back much further than Albuquerque, past the restaurants and the donations, and the friendly greetings at the counter, back to a country far from New Mexico, where almost nothing about this man's past adds up the way it should. Section 2. An origin the show refuses to explain. Every villain has a story about where they came from. Most shows tell you that story pretty early, because audiences like knowing why a character turned out the way they did. Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul do something almost the opposite with Gus Fring. Across 2 full series and more than a decade of storytelling, the writers give you pieces of his past, small clues dropped here and there, but they never once sit you down and explain the whole thing. That choice was not an accident or a mistake. It was a deliberate decision by the man who created the show, and it might be one of the smartest choices ever made about a television villain. Gus was born in Chile. That part is not really in question. What happened to him there, before he ever set foot in Mexico or the United States, is where everything gets foggy on purpose. The timing of his early life lines up with one of the darkest periods in Chilean history, the years when the country was run by a military dictator named Augusto Pinochet, who held power from the early 1970s through 1990. That government was known for violence against its own people, for secret police, for people disappearing and never being found again, and for years of fear that shaped an entire generation of Chileans. The show never spells out exactly what Gus did during those years, or what side of that history he was on. It only gives you hints, and those hints point towards something troubling. One of the biggest hints comes from Hector Salamanca, the old cartel enforcer who becomes one of Gus's greatest enemies. In a flashback shown later in the story, Hector mockingly calls Gus by a nickname, referring to him as the Big Generalissimo. Generalissimo is a very high military rank, the kind of title given to a top commander or a leader of an army, not a nickname you would casually give to a random businessman with no military background at all. Hector would not invent a joke like that out of nowhere. The show is using that one line to suggest, without ever confirming it directly, that Gus may have had some real connection to the military side of Pinochet's government, the same government responsible for years of abuse and fear across the country. It is one sentence, delivered as an insult, and it carries the weight of an entire hidden chapter of a man's life that the audience is never allowed to fully see. Better Call Saul adds another small piece to this puzzle without ever completing it. In one episode, Gus is shown speaking with a business partner named Peter Schuler, a man connected to the German company that owns part of Gus's restaurant chain. During a tense moment, when Peter is panicking over threats to Gus's business, Gus brings up something the two of them apparently went through together back in Santiago, the capital city of Chile. Gus mentions it calmly, almost like a private code between the two of them, something meant to steady Peter down and remind him that they have survived something difficult before. The show never tells you what that shared experience actually was. It only tells you it happened, and that it was serious enough to still matter to both men years later, on the other side of the world, in the middle of a completely different crisis. The most direct piece of evidence about how much Gus's past actually matters to the story comes from a flashback tied to Don Eladio, the head of the cartel Gus worked under for 2 decades. In that flashback, right after ordering the murder of Gus's business partner Max, Eladio makes a point of sparing Gus's life instead of having him killed alongside Max. Eladio does not explain his reasoning to anyone else in the room. He simply tells Gus, in effect, that he knows who Gus really is. That single line is doing an enormous amount of work in the story. It tells you that somewhere out there exists a version of Gus's history that Eladio is aware of, a version important enough and dangerous enough that the leader of a major cartel decided sparing this one man's life was worth more than punishing him equally alongside his murdered partner. Whatever Eladio knew about Gus's past, it was enough to change the outcome of that entire scene. This becomes even stranger when you look at how little official proof of any of it actually exists. Later in the story, when Hank Schrader starts investigating Gus as part of his hunt for whoever is really running the meth trade in Albuquerque, he tries to dig into Gus's background the normal way any investigator would, by looking for records. He comes up with almost nothing. There is no solid documentation of Gus's early life in Chile that Hank can find. When this gap comes up, Gus has an explanation ready, blaming it on poor record-keeping by the Chilean government during those chaotic years. That is a believable enough excuse on its own, since record-keeping genuinely was a mess in many countries during periods of political upheaval like that one. But when you put that explanation next to Eladio's comment about knowing who Gus really is, the excuse starts to feel less like an accident of history, and more like a story Gus has been telling for years, one built specifically so that nobody official could ever check it. This raises the obvious question that the show never fully answers. Is Gustavo Fring even his real name? The show plants that question without giving you a clear yes or no. If his background truly was erased, or hidden that thoroughly, if a cartel leader as powerful as Eladio spoke about him in terms of secret identity, rather than simple history, then it becomes entirely possible that the man everyone in Albuquerque knew as Gus Fring built that name and that entire identity from scratch once he crossed into a new life. A completely fictional name would explain why searches into his past keep turning up empty. It would also explain why Gus never once panics when those searches fail. A man hiding something usually gets nervous when someone starts digging. Gus never does. He answers Hank's suspicion with the same calm he uses in every other part of his life, because he has likely spent years preparing for exactly this kind of question. There is a detail worth pointing out here about the writing itself, since it is a small window into how deliberately this mystery was built. The show's creator has openly compared Gus's unexplained background to the glowing briefcase from the movie Pulp Fiction. a famous example of a mystery that a story never explains and never needs to explain, because the not knowing is part of what makes it work. That comparison tells you everything about the intention behind Gus's past. This was never a mistake or a loose thread the writers forgot to tie up. It was built to stay open on purpose, because a villain whose full history remains just out of reach feels more unsettling than one whose entire life story gets laid out for you in a single flashback episode. Think about what that decision actually does to how an audience experiences this character. Most villains get explained sooner or later. You learn about a difficult childhood, a betrayal, a specific moment where things went wrong for them, and that explanation usually makes the villain feel smaller and more understandable by the end. Gus never gets that treatment. Every time the story hands you a new piece of his past, it comes wrapped in exactly the kind of vagueness we have already gone through. A nickname instead of a confirmed rank. A mention of a shared memory instead of a real explanation. A line about knowing who someone really is instead of an actual name for what that means. The pieces add up to a feeling rather than a fact. The feeling is that this man has done something, or been through something, serious enough to leave a permanent mark on how dangerous people like Eladio and Hector treat him. And yet none of us, including everyone watching at home, gets to know exactly what that something was. That refusal to explain him fully changes the entire shape of his threat. A villain with a clear backstory has edges. You can measure him. You know where he came from and roughly what shaped him. And that knowledge, whether you realize it or not, puts a kind of ceiling on how frightening he can be, because familiarity tends to soften fear. Gus never gets that ceiling. Because the show keeps the door only partly open, your imagination has to fill in the rest, and imagination is almost always scarier than a clear answer would have been. Maybe he really was connected to the military abuses of the Pinochet years. Maybe the shared experience with Peter and Santiago was something violent, something both men barely survived. Maybe Gustavo Fring is a name he built entirely for himself, a fresh identity assembled the moment he needed to disappear from whatever his life had been before. The show gives you just enough thread to imagine any of those possibilities, without ever letting you pull hard enough to see where the thread actually ends. This mystery also does something quieter, and just as important, which is that it protects the character from ever feeling like a simple type. A lot of crime stories eventually explain their worst characters using easy shortcuts, saying in effect that a rough childhood or a specific tragedy made them who they are, as if cruelty always comes with a tidy cause and effect behind it. Gus never gets that shortcut. Nobody watching gets to comfortably decide that his choices in Albuquerque make full sense once you know what happened to him decades earlier, because the show simply refuses to give you that full picture. What you are left with instead is a man whose calm, whose control, whose total comfort with violence when violence becomes necessary, all exist without a clean origin story attached to explain them away. That absence forces you to judge him purely by what he actually does in front of you, rather than by some earlier trauma the story uses to soften the judgment. In a strange way, that makes him feel more real. Very few people in real life get a tidy origin story either. Most of what shapes a person stays hidden, known only in fragments even to the people closest to them, and Gus is written with exactly that same kind of unfinished, unknowable weight. It is also worth sitting for a moment on how unusual this restraint is, coming from the writers themselves. It would have been easy, and probably tempting, to build an entire flashback episode explaining exactly what happened to young Gus in Chile, giving the audience a clean answer wrapped up with a bow. Plenty of shows would have done exactly that, especially once a character became as popular and as talked about as this one did. Instead, across years of storytelling and 2 full series, the writers held that line. They gave you a handful of loaded words, a nickname, a shared memory, an unofficial claim of recognition from a powerful man. And then they moved on, trusting the audience to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, rather than handing over an easy resolution. That kind of patience in the writing mirrors the patience of the character himself. Gus waited 20 years for his revenge without ever losing control. The show, in its own way, waited just as long without ever losing its nerve either. None of this means the mystery is pointless, or just a trick to seem interesting. Every piece of it connects directly to the choices Gus makes once he actually appears in Albuquerque. A man who may have come from a violent, dangerous political world, who may have needed to build an entirely new identity just to survive long enough to start over, is exactly the kind of man who would understand better than almost anyone how valuable a spotless public reputation really is. If his past really was as unstable and as dangerous as the hints suggest, then the discipline he shows later, the total control, the years of patience, the refusal to ever let his temper slip in public, starts to look less like a personality quirk and more like a survival skill, built through hard experience, long before he ever opened a single chicken restaurant. The mystery is not separate from the man you see running Los Pollos Hermanos. It is the foundation underneath him, even if the show only ever lets you see the foundation in shadow. There is one more piece of this history worth mentioning, because it shows just how deeply hidden Gus kept even the parts of his life close to home. During the events shown in Breaking Bad, when Walter White visits Gus's house for dinner, there are signs around the home suggesting children live there, including toys scattered around the room, and Gus even mentions that his children will not eat one of his favorite Chilean dishes. Later on, when Jesse Pinkman visits that same house, all of those signs are gone. No toys, no mention of children anywhere. The show never clears up whether Gus actually has a family hidden somewhere, whether that detail was ever real at all, or whether it was simply part of the same carefully built performance he uses everywhere else in his life. Even his own home, the most private space a person has, gets treated the same way his restaurants do, dressed up differently depending on who is watching, and never fully honest with anyone standing inside it. Everything about this man's past sits behind a locked door, and the story never gives you the key. What you get instead are pressure marks on the door itself, the reactions of powerful, dangerous people who clearly know something real is behind it, even if you never will. That is a rare kind of writing discipline, and it is part of why this character has stuck with people the way he has. A villain you can fully explain eventually becomes a villain you can fully predict. Gus never lets that happen. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Knowing this much about how carefully hidden his past really is only makes the next part of his story land harder. Because eventually, the show does pull back the curtain on one piece of it, just one. The single relationship from his early years that the writers finally do let you see in full. And what that flashback reveals is the reason 20 years of patience, silence, and control were ever necessary in the first place. Section 3. Max Arciniega and the Origin of the Empire. Before there was a chicken restaurant chain worth millions of dollars, before there were 14 locations spread across New Mexico, before there was a secret lab buried under an industrial laundry building, there were just two men in Mexico with an idea. One of those men was Gus. The other was Max Arciniega. And understanding who Max was, and what he meant to Gus, changes the way everything that happens later actually reads. Max was a gifted young man, with a real talent for chemistry. He was smart in the kind of way that gets noticed early, the kind of student teachers remember for years afterward. At some point in his life, before any of the events people usually think of when they think of this story, Gus paid for Max's education. That detail matters more than it might seem at first. Paying for someone's schooling is not a small favor between casual acquaintances. It is the kind of investment a person makes in someone they believe in deeply, someone they plan to build a future with. Gus saw something in Max, worth investing years of money and support into, long before either of them had built anything close to an empire. Together, the two of them opened a restaurant in Mexico, and they called it Los Pollos Hermanos, which means the Chicken Brothers. On the surface, it looked exactly like what the name suggests, a modest place serving chicken to regular customers. But underneath that simple beginning sat something much bigger. The restaurant was never just about selling food. From the very start, it was built to be a front, a legal-looking business that could hide a much more dangerous operation running quietly behind it. Max had the chemistry skills to produce a very high-quality version of methamphetamine, and Gus had the business mind to figure out how to move it, hide it, and turn it into real money. The chicken restaurant gave them a reason to exist in public, a reason for money to move around, a reason for trucks to travel, and a reason for nobody to ask too many questions about two young men suddenly living well. It helps to understand what the drug world looked like at that time, because it explains why their plan was actually a fairly bold idea for its era. Meth back then was widely seen as a low-value, low-respect drug, something looked down on, compared to cocaine, which the big cartels considered their real business. Cocaine had the prestige, cocaine had the established networks, and the established buyers. Meth was treated more like a rough, cheap product, used by people the cartels did not think much of. Gus, though, saw something the bigger players were missing. He understood that meth had one enormous advantage that cocaine never could, which is that meth does not have to be grown somewhere specific and then shipped across long distances the way cocaine does. Meth can be made almost anywhere, in a lab, using chemistry rather than farmland. With a chemist as talented as Max standing next to him, Gus saw a path toward a product that could be produced locally, controlled completely from start to finish, and made far more potent than anything the low-quality meth of that era usually looked like. That insight, on its own, tells you something important about how Gus thought, even as a very young man building his very first business. He was not simply looking at what was profitable right then. He was looking 2 steps further down the road, imagining a version of the drug trade that most established cartel leaders were not yet paying attention to. That kind of long-range thinking, seeing value in something everyone else is currently ignoring, becomes one of the clearest threads running through his entire life. Even decades later, when he is running a massive operation in Albuquerque, that same instinct, staying ahead of what other people have not yet realized is coming, keeps showing up again and again. The two of them eventually decided their local success in Mexico was not enough. If Max's meth was really as good as they believed, if their business model really could work at a larger scale, then it made sense to try bringing that product to the people who controlled the biggest distribution networks in the region, the cartel, led by Don Eladio Fuente. Approaching a man like Eladio was an enormous risk. Eladio ran an operation built almost entirely around cocaine, and men like him do not usually welcome outsiders showing up with a different product and a request to be taken seriously. But Gus and Max believed in what they had built, enough to make the pitch anyway. They wanted access to Eladio's global reach, the kind of distribution power that would let their product travel far beyond what 2 men running a chicken restaurant could manage on their own. This is where the story of their partnership becomes more than just a business arrangement, because the relationship between Gus and Max was never only professional. For a long time, the exact nature of their bond was something the show only hinted at, never stating it directly, letting small moments and quiet details build up in the background for years without ever confirming what they meant. There were comments made by other characters that pointed in a certain direction. Hector Salamanca, never a man known for kindness, once suggested a cruder version of the restaurant's name, twisting the Chicken Brothers into something meant as an insult, about the true nature of Gus and Max's relationship. Later, another cartel figure named Lalo Salamanca refers to Max directly as Gus's boyfriend, while discussing him with another cartel member. Neither of those moments came from a narrator explaining things plainly to the audience. They came from other characters, often cruel or dismissive ones, throwing out comments that the show trusted its audience to notice and sit with. Eventually, the ambiguity around their relationship stopped being ambiguous at all. The person who ran the show for its later years, Peter Gould, confirmed publicly in 2022 that Gus and Max were, in fact, lovers, not simply close business partners. That confirmation mattered, because it reframed years of small details that fans had been piecing together on their own for a long time. It explained why Gus's grief over losing Max, which the story eventually shows in full, hit as hard as it did. It explained the quiet moments, scattered across both shows, where Gus seemed to be carrying something heavier than the loss of a good business partner. And it added real weight to a detail revealed elsewhere in Better Call Saul, where Gus is shown to have acquired a small property on the Mexican side of the border, a place that serves as cover for another part of his operation, but which also contains something much more personal, a fountain, built and dedicated entirely to Max. A man does not build a private fountain in someone's memory because that person was simply a good business associate. That kind of tribute belongs to something closer, something that mattered on a level far beyond profit and partnership. There is another moment worth mentioning here, one that appears later in the story, after everything with Max has already happened, but which connects directly back to this same relationship. After Gus finally succeeds in removing a dangerous threat to his operation, a rival named Lalo Salamanca, the show shows him taking a rare moment to relax. He visits a quiet wine bar and has a conversation with another man there, a scene that touches gently on a side of Gus that almost never gets shown anywhere else in the story, a side connected once again to the same part of his life that Max belonged to. It is a small, quiet scene, easy to miss if you are not paying attention, but it fits into the same pattern as everything else involving Max. The show never explains this part of Gus loudly. It only shows it, briefly, and moves on, trusting you to understand what you just saw, without needing it spelled out. Knowing all of this changes how you should think about the early version of Gus, the one running a small restaurant in Mexico, with a man he loved, and a business idea that most established criminals of the time would have laughed at. This was not yet the untouchable, ice-cold figure who would later run an empire across an entire region of the United States. This was a younger man building something with someone he cared about deeply, taking a real risk by walking into a meeting with one of the most powerful cartel leaders in the region, hoping that the product he and Max had built together was strong enough to earn them a real place at that table. It is worth thinking for a moment about what that meeting actually represented for both of them. Two young men, one a gifted chemist and one a sharp businessman, walking into a room controlled by people who had spent years building fear and power the traditional way, through cocaine, through violence, through control of established smuggling routes. Gus and Max were not bringing muscle into that room. They were bringing a product and an idea, betting that quality and cleverness could open a door that intimidation usually opened for other men. That is a very different kind of confidence than the confidence Gus would later be known for. Later in his life, his confidence comes from decades of careful planning and total control over every outcome. In this earlier chapter, his confidence came from belief. Belief in Max's talent, belief in his own read on where the drug trade was heading, and belief that the risk of walking into that room was worth taking for the chance at something bigger. None of that confidence changes how dangerous a decision it really was. Approaching a cartel boss with an unsanctioned product, one that had already been produced and possibly sold without official permission, was the kind of move that could easily end badly. Cartels in this world do not typically respond well to outsiders operating on their turf without asking first. And Gus and Max had, by that point, already been quietly making and selling their product before ever bringing it formally to Eladio's attention. That detail matters, because it means the meeting they were walking into was not simply a hopeful business pitch from two newcomers. It was, in a sense, a confession as much as a proposal, an attempt to turn something they had already been doing quietly into something official and protected. Whether Eladio would see that honesty as a sign of good faith or as an insult to his authority was something neither Gus nor Max could fully control once they walked through that door. This is also a good moment to point out something about how differently the two men are remembered by everyone else in the story going forward. Max never gets the chance to become the version of himself that Gus eventually becomes. His story ends early, before he ever gets to see whether the empire he helped design would actually succeed the way he and Gus imagined. Everything that Los Pollos Hermanos becomes later, the 14 locations, the corporate ties to a large German company, the underground lab capable of producing enormous amounts of meth, all of it grows out of an idea that started with two men and one small restaurant, but only one of those two men ever lives to see any part of that growth happen. That imbalance, one partner surviving to build the empire and one partner never making it past the earliest chapter of the story, becomes the emotional center of everything that follows for the next 20 years of Gus's life. It is easy, looking at the version of Gus running a massive operation in Albuquerque, to forget that he started as half of a partnership, not as a solo operator, building something entirely on his own. The version of him people usually picture first, the calm restaurant owner in a tucked-in shirt, calmly managing an empire with total control, comes much later. Before that man existed, there was a younger Gus who needed Max just as much as Max needed him. One man with the chemistry knowledge to make something extraordinary, and one man with the vision and the nerve to imagine turning that product into something much bigger than either of them could have built alone. Neither half of that partnership would have worked without the other. Max's product without Gus's business mind would have stayed small, maybe even stayed local and unnoticed. Gus's ambition without Max's chemistry would have had nothing real behind it to sell. Understanding this partnership as a real and personal bond, not just a convenient business arrangement, makes the ending of their story land with far more weight than it otherwise would. This was not two strangers working together for money who happened to lose one member of their team along the way. This was a man walking into the most dangerous meeting of his life, alongside someone he loved, someone whose education he had paid for, someone whose talent he believed in completely, someone he had built an entire private life around outside of the business itself. Whatever confidence carried the two of them through that meeting with Eladio, whatever hope either of them felt about the future they were about to build together, none of it prepared either man for what was actually waiting for them in that room. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That meeting, the one both men walked into together, with everything they had built resting on the outcome, is where their story together comes to an end, and where the story of everything Gus becomes afterward truly begins. Section 4. The Massacre at Don Eladio's Pool. Every partnership has a moment that decides whether it survives contact with the real world. For Gus and Max, that moment happened in Mexico, at the compound of Don Eladio Fuente, the man who sat at the very top of the cartel structure that controlled almost everything moving through that part of the world. Everything the two of them had built up until that point, the restaurant, the product, the years of quiet planning, all of it came down to a single afternoon at Eladio's pool. Understanding the story of that day means understanding a little about Eladio himself, and about the world Gus and Max were walking into. Eladio ran his organization the way a lot of powerful men run things when nobody has ever seriously challenged them, with total confidence that his rules were the only rules that mattered. His cartel controlled cocaine, and cocaine at that time was treated as the real business, the respected business, the product that made men rich and dangerous and untouchable. Meth, by comparison, was seen as something lesser, something the big players did not need to bother with. Gus and Max were about to walk into Eladio's world, carrying a product from exactly that category, hoping their quality would be enough to earn them a seat. Nobody expected two young outsiders to be given. There is something almost painfully innocent about how the two of them approached this meeting, at least by the standards of the world they were stepping into. Gus and Max had already been quietly producing and selling their meth before ever asking Eladio for permission. That detail matters, because it means the pitch they were bringing to him was not simply a hopeful proposal from two newcomers with an idea. It was closer to an admission that they had already been operating on his territory, without asking first, and they were now hoping to turn that quiet arrangement into something official. To men like Eladio, that kind of independence, even when it comes wrapped in politeness and good business sense, tends to look less like ambition and more like disrespect. Whether Gus and Max fully understood how that pitch would land the moment they walked through the gates of Eladio's compound is something the story never spells out directly, but the outcome speaks for itself. The meeting did not go the way either of them had hoped. Eladio was not impressed by their offer. If anything, the fact that they had already been dealing meth without his blessing seemed to insult him rather than intrigue him. He was the one who controlled that territory, and two young men showing up with a product he had never approved, already sold quietly under his nose, was not the kind of confidence he was willing to reward. Rather than seeing an opportunity worth exploring, Eladio treated the whole situation as a problem that needed to be corrected immediately, in front of everyone present. What happened next is one of the most brutal moments the story ever shows, and it happens without warning, the way real violence often does in this kind of world. Sudden and final, rather than dramatic and drawn out. Eladio gave the order, and Hector Salamanca, the same man who would later become Gus's greatest enemy for the rest of his life, was the one who carried it out. Hector shot Max in the head, right there at the meeting, as punishment for selling meth in cartel territory, without permission. There was no negotiation before it happened. There was no warning shot, no final offer to make things right. One moment Max was a partner, sitting across from powerful men, making a pitch for the future the two of them had built together. And the next moment, he was gone. Gus was forced to watch it happen. He did not get the chance to step in, to argue, to offer some last plan to fix things. The show gives us his reaction in that moment, with total honesty, and it is not the reaction people expect from the man he later becomes. He was outraged. He broke down in tears. This was not the calm, controlled figure that audiences meet years later, running restaurants and managing empires, without ever raising his voice. This was a much younger man, watching the person he loved get killed in front of him, with absolutely no power in that moment to stop it, or change the outcome. Whatever version of Gus existed before that afternoon, whatever balance of confidence and hope had carried him and Max into that meeting together, ended the second Hector pulled the trigger. What happened immediately after Max's death is almost as important as the killing itself, because it explains everything that follows for the next 20 years of Gus's life. Eladio did not have Gus killed alongside his partner. He spared him, but he did not spare him out of any kindness or mercy. When Eladio explains his reasoning, he does not offer comfort or apology. He simply tells Gus that the only reason he is not being killed too is because Eladio knows who Gus really is. That is the entire explanation given. No further detail, no name attached to whatever history or reputation Eladio was referring to, just a flat statement that some deeper knowledge about Gus's past was serious enough to keep him alive in a moment where his own partner had just been executed a few feet away from him. Hector adds one more line to the scene before it ends. A line that, on the surface, sounds almost like an insult, but which turns out to carry enormous weight over the following decades. He tells Gus to stick to chicken. It is meant as a dismissal, a way of putting Gus back in his place after watching his partner's ambition get punished so violently. Stick to chicken. Run your little restaurant. Stay in your lane, and do not try to reach for anything bigger than that ever again. Hector could not have known, standing there in that moment, just how long that single insult would echo, or how much Gus would eventually make him regret ever saying it. The years that followed that day did not give Gus any freedom to walk away from the men who had just killed the person he loved. Eladio spared his life, but that mercy came with conditions attached. Gus was forced to keep working with the cartel, cooperating fully on Eladio's terms, for the next 20 years. He did not get to disappear quietly and rebuild his life somewhere, far away from the men responsible for what happened at that pool. He had to stay close to them, stay useful to them, and appear loyal to them, all while carrying the memory of watching his partner die at their hands. That is an almost unimaginable position to be forced into. Imagine having to smile, cooperate, and follow the orders of the very people who took away the person you loved most, year after year, without ever being allowed to show even a flicker of what you were actually feeling underneath. This is the part of the story that explains almost everything about who Gus becomes afterward. He did not respond to what happened at Eladio's pool with immediate revenge, even though every instinct in a normal person might expect that kind of reaction. He did not lash out. He did not try to strike back quickly while his grief was still raw, which almost certainly would have gotten him killed as well, given how completely outmatched he was against Eladio's organization at that point in his life. Instead, he did something far harder and far rarer. He buried everything he was feeling, put on a face of loyalty and cooperation, and began a plan that would take 20 full years to complete. 20 years of appearing to accept his place, appearing to have moved past what happened, appearing to be exactly the kind of quiet, cooperative businessman that Eladio and Hector expected him to be, all while never once forgetting what had actually happened, or letting go of what he intended to eventually do about it. That kind of patience is almost impossible to fully appreciate, unless you sit with how long 20 years actually is. It is long enough for an entire childhood to happen. It is long enough for careers to start and end. It is long enough for most people carrying that kind of pain to eventually let it soften, to move on in some way, to find some kind of peace or distraction that dulls the sharpest edges of what they went through. Gus never let that happen to himself. He carried the memory of that pool, the memory of Max's death, the memory of Hector telling him to stick to chicken, for 2 full decades, without ever letting it show on his face, without ever letting it slow down. The careful, methodical way he built his life back up from nothing. During those 20 years, Gus did exactly what Hector had mockingly told him to do. He stuck to chicken. He built Los Pollos Hermanos from a single restaurant in Mexico into a full chain, spreading across the American Southwest, eventually growing to 14 locations. On paper, that growth looked like nothing more than a successful business story. A smart entrepreneur turning a small idea into a respected regional chain. In reality, every single one of those new locations, every dollar of legitimate profit, every friendly relationship built with local officials and law enforcement was part of a much longer plan that had nothing to do with chicken at all. He was building the platform he would eventually use to become independent from the very men who had killed Max, and eventually, to bring their entire organization down. It is worth pausing here to think about what kind of internal discipline this actually requires. Most people, even people capable of real patience, eventually let some sign of what they are planning slip out. Some moment of anger. Some slip in how they treat the people responsible for their pain. Gus never allowed himself that release. He remained outwardly loyal to the cartel, for the entire 20 years, working within their system, following their terms, cooperating with distribution and payment as expected, all while privately building toward a moment when none of that cooperation would be necessary anymore. That kind of sustained self-control, held for 2 decades without a single visible crack, is part of what makes him feel less like an ordinary criminal and more like something closer to a force of pure will. The insult about sticking to chicken deserves one more moment of attention because of how completely it gets turned around by the end of the story. Hector meant those words as a way of shrinking Gus down, reminding him of his place, making sure he understood that reaching for anything bigger than a small restaurant business was not something he would ever be allowed to do again. Instead, chicken became the exact foundation that let Gus eventually surpass everyone who underestimated him that day. The restaurant chain that was supposed to be a punishment, a reminder to stay small, became one of the most successful legitimate business fronts ever built for a criminal operation, and eventually became the very thing that let Gus operate independently of the cartel altogether. Hector spent years mocking Gus by calling him the Chicken Man, never once realizing that the chicken business he was mocking was quietly becoming powerful enough to end the Salamanca family and the cartel around them entirely. There is also something worth noting about how differently this event reads, depending on when you learn about it in the story. Audiences meeting Gus for the first time in Albuquerque have no idea any of this happened. They see a calm, controlled, generous business owner, someone who seems to have built his success the normal way, through hard work and good decisions. It is only much later, once this flashback finally gets shown, that everything about his character reorganizes itself in your mind. Every calm decision, every moment of extreme patience, every refusal to let anger show on his face, even in the most dangerous situations, all of it traces back to this single afternoon at Eladio's pool. He learned, in the worst possible way, exactly what happens to people who move too fast, who show their hand too early, who let ambition outrun caution before they have built enough power to survive the consequences. Max's death was not just a tragedy Gus carried privately. It became the exact lesson that shaped every decision Gus made for the rest of his life. This also explains something important about why his eventual revenge takes the shape that it does. A lot of stories about revenge involve someone moving quickly and violently the moment they finally get the chance to strike back. That is not what happens with Gus. Even once he finally has the power and the position to move against the people responsible for Max's death, he still does not rush. He still waits for exactly the right moment, still builds every piece of his plan with the same patience that carried him through the previous 20 years. The pool at Eladio's compound did not just take away someone Gus loved. It taught him, in the most painful way possible, that patience is the only thing standing between ambition and disaster, and that lesson never leaves him, not even decades later, when he finally has the power to act on everything he has been quietly planning since that day. Knowing all of this changes how every earlier calm moment from Gus should be understood. Every polite smile, every carefully worded response, every refusal to let his temper show, all of it sits on top of a foundation built the day he watched Max die and was told, essentially, to know his place and stay there. He accepted that instruction outwardly for 20 full years. Inwardly, he was building toward the exact opposite outcome. One restaurant, one location, one quiet business decision at a time, until the empire built to look like nothing more than a chicken chain became powerful enough to make Eladio's entire cartel disappear. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That 20-year wait, though, was never just about staying alive. It was about building something specific, a business and a network strong enough to eventually operate completely outside the cartel's control, on American soil, far from the reach of the men who had killed Max in the first place. And what Gus built during those quiet years in Albuquerque turned out to be far more advanced and far more dangerous than anyone watching him run a chicken restaurant could have ever guessed. Section 5. Building an empire inside the cartel's blind spot. For 20 years, Gus lived a kind of double life that most people would find impossible to sustain. On the outside, he was a loyal partner to the cartel, moving their cocaine through his growing chain of restaurants, following the rules Eladio had set for him after Max was killed. Underneath that surface, he was quietly building something the cartel never noticed, something that would eventually make them completely unnecessary to him. Understanding how he pulled this off says a lot about why he stands apart from almost every other criminal in this kind of story. The first thing to understand is what Gus was actually working with in the beginning. He had a small chain of restaurants and a painful memory of watching his partner die. He did not have an army. He did not have the kind of raw firepower that men like Hector or Eladio commanded. What he had instead was patience, a sharp mind for business, and a willingness to build slowly instead of reaching for power too fast, the way he and Max had once tried to do. That earlier mistake, walking into Eladio's compound with a product they had not been given permission to sell, had already taught him what happens when ambition moves faster than protection. He was determined never to make that mistake again. So instead of trying to break free from the cartel right away, Gus did something much smarter and much slower. He expanded his restaurant business the honest way, opening new locations one at a time, building a reputation as a successful and generous businessman in his community. Over the years, Los Pollos Hermanos grew from that single restaurant in Mexico into a chain of 14 locations spread across New Mexico and neighboring states. Each new restaurant gave him more trucks moving through more places, more employees who trusted him completely, and more reasons for people to see him as exactly what he appeared to be, a hard-working business owner building something respectable. While all of that legitimate growth was happening in plain sight, Gus was also using the same restaurant network to keep moving cocaine for the cartel, exactly as Eladio expected him to. This is the part that made his position so unusual. He was not secretly working against the cartel from some hidden location far away. He was standing right inside their supply chain, following their rules, staying visibly loyal, all while using their own trust in him to slowly build resources they knew nothing about. Every truck that moved cocaine for the cartel was also a truck that could just as easily move something else. Every dollar of legitimate restaurant profit added another layer of financial cover that made his operation harder to question. He was hiding his independence inside the very system meant to control him. At some point, Gus's restaurant chain became connected to a much larger company, a German business called Madrigal Electromotive. Los Pollos Hermanos became a subsidiary of that larger corporation, which meant Gus's chicken business now had international backing and a much more complicated paper trail behind it. This kind of corporate structure might sound like a boring detail, but it mattered enormously for someone trying to stay hidden. A business connected to a large, legitimate international company looks far less suspicious than a standalone restaurant chain with no real financial history behind it. If anyone ever tried to look closely at where Gus's money was really coming from, they would run into layers of corporate paperwork and international business records long before they ever got close to the truth. This connection to Madrigal also introduced Gus to people who would matter enormously later in his story. One of those people was a woman named Lydia Rodarte Quayle, who worked as the head of logistics for Madrigal, based out of their offices in Texas. Lydia understood shipping and distribution at a professional level most criminals never get access to, and she became an important part of how Gus eventually figured out how to move his product safely across huge distances without drawing attention. It was actually Lydia who first proposed the idea of building a large, hidden laboratory capable of producing meth on an industrial scale An idea that would completely change the size of what Gus was capable of doing on his own. That idea eventually became real. Gus and a business partner named Peter Schuler financed the construction of a massive underground lab, a project that ended up costing more than $8 million. Building something like that is not a quick decision. It requires trust in the people helping to build it, careful planning about where it can be hidden, and enough money already flowing quietly through legitimate businesses to cover a cost that large, without anyone asking uncomfortable questions about where it came from. The fact that Gus could even consider spending that much money on a single secret project tells you how much financial strength he had already built up during those years of running his restaurants and staying outwardly loyal to the cartel. The location chosen for this lab was almost as clever as the lab itself. Gus built it underneath an industrial laundry facility called Lavanderia Brillante, a business that, on paper, did exactly what it claimed to do, cleaning large quantities of linens and uniforms for hotels and other companies around Albuquerque. That laundry business gave him another completely legal reason for large trucks to come and go regularly, for workers to move in and out of the building at strange hours, and for large amounts of water and electricity to be used without raising suspicion. Underneath all of that ordinary daily business activity sat a lab capable of producing meth on a scale far beyond anything a small operation could manage. Nobody looking at trucks delivering clean linens to hotels would ever imagine what was happening several floors beneath their feet. Building something that large and that secret required more than good ideas. It required people willing to actually do the physical work of construction without ever telling anyone what they were really building. This is where a man named Mike Ehrmantraut becomes an important part of the story. Mike first crossed paths with Gus almost by accident, while investigating a tracking device that had been placed on his own car. That investigation led him to observe Gus's restaurant operation during what looked like a routine money drop. Gus noticed Mike watching him, and rather than treating this as a threat, Gus saw an opportunity. Through Lydia and the connections at Madrigal, Mike was eventually brought in and recruited as a security consultant, a role that would grow into something far more important over the following years. Mike turned out to be exactly the kind of person Gus needed at this stage of building his empire. Someone careful, disciplined, and experienced enough to manage the physical dangers of running a hidden operation without letting emotion or carelessness put everything at risk. Gus did not build trust with Mike quickly or casually. He built it the same slow, careful way he built everything else, watching how Mike handled pressure, how he handled secrecy, and how he responded when things did not go according to plan. Once that trust was established, Mike became the person responsible for overseeing the construction of the underground lab itself, managing workers, handling security, and making sure nothing about the project ever leaked out to anyone who could use that information against Gus. The lab could not be built by just anyone off the street either. Gus needed skilled engineers who understood how to excavate a large hidden space underneath an existing building without drawing attention from the outside world. This led to hiring a team of workers brought in from Germany, led by an engineer named Werner Ziegler, who was tasked with overseeing the construction in complete secrecy. These workers were kept isolated during the project, housed away from the public, kept away from friends and family for long stretches of time, all in an effort to prevent even a single detail about the project from slipping out. That level of control over an entire team of hired workers shows just how seriously Gus treated secrecy at every stage of building his empire, never leaving anything to chance, never assuming that good intentions from his employees would be enough to keep something this dangerous hidden. Even the design of the lab itself came from someone Gus had personally invested in long before construction ever began. A chemist named Gail Bodeker, who Gus had sponsored through his education much earlier, was the person responsible for designing the layout of the lab. This detail connects back to something we already know about how Gus operates. Just as he once invested in Max's education years earlier in Mexico, Gus continued that same pattern decades later, quietly funding the education of talented people who might one day become useful to whatever he was planning next. Gale's schooling was not simply an act of generosity. It was an investment that eventually paid off in the form of a professionally designed laboratory, capable of producing enormous quantities of extremely pure meth. Once the physical lab existed, Gus still needed a way to actually move his product without ever getting caught. And this is where the true genius of hiding everything inside his restaurant business becomes clear. The meth Gus's operation eventually produced was smuggled using something almost nobody would ever think to check: the batter used to fry chicken at his restaurants. Drugs were hidden inside containers of fry batter, delivered regularly to his locations, each one marked with a small stamp that could only be seen under a special kind of light. Authorities searching for drugs being smuggled across the region would have had no reason to ever suspect batter deliveries meant for a respected regional fast food chain. And even if they had somehow decided to check, they would have had no way of identifying which containers among countless regular deliveries actually contained anything hidden inside them. Think about what this actually represents. Gus did not simply build a hidden lab and hope nobody would find it by luck. He built an entire supply chain around his restaurant business, specifically so that drugs could travel the exact same routes as completely legal chicken deliveries, using the exact same trucks, driven by the exact same employees, most of whom had no idea what they were actually transporting. The restaurant business was never just a cover story, sitting on top of the real business. It was woven directly into every physical step of how the real business actually operated, from production to packaging to transportation, all disguised as the daily operations of a completely normal food company. All of this, the restaurant expansion, the corporate connections through Madrigal, the underground lab, the disguised smuggling network, took years to build, and every part of it happened while Gus remained outwardly cooperative with the cartel that had killed Max. That is the detail that makes this entire section of his story so remarkable. He was not secretly working against Eladio's organization, from some hidden fortress far away from their reach. He was building all of this while still delivering cocaine on their behalf, still following their rules, still playing the role of a loyal, cooperative partner every single time cartel representatives came to check on him. The cartel believed they had full control over Gus for 2 decades, when in reality, right under their supervision, he was quietly assembling the exact tools he would eventually need to make their entire organization disappear. There is something worth pointing out about how differently Gus approached risk compared to almost every other criminal figure in this story. Men like Tuco Salamanca, or even Hector in his younger years, operated through fear and unpredictability, relying on violence and intimidation to get what they wanted quickly. Gus took the opposite path entirely. Every single piece of his empire was built slowly, tested carefully, and protected by layers of legitimate business activity that made it almost impossible to trace back to its true purpose. He never rushed the process, even when it would have been tempting to move faster once he had real power building underneath him. The same patience that helped him survive the 20 years following Max's death carried directly into how he built every physical part of his operation. One careful decision at a time, never skipping a step, just because he was eager to see results sooner. It is also worth remembering how much trust Gus had to place in other people to make all of this work, and how carefully he managed that trust. Mike Ehrmantraut, Lydia Rodarte Quayle, Gail Boticher, the German construction crew led by Werner Ziegler, all of these people held pieces of a secret that could have destroyed Gus's entire life if it ever got out. Managing that many moving parts, that many people who each knew a different fragment of the full picture, required exactly the kind of careful, methodical thinking that Gus had clearly developed over many years. Nobody involved in building this empire knew the entire picture from start to finish. Each person understood their own piece of the puzzle, and Gus was the only one who ever held the complete picture in his head at once. By the time this entire structure was fully built, restaurants spread across multiple states, corporate backing from an international company, a hidden lab capable of producing enormous quantities of extremely high-quality meth, and a smuggling network disguised inside completely ordinary food deliveries, Gus had built something far beyond what Eladio's cartel had ever imagined when they spared his life all those years earlier at that pool. He had built an operation capable of standing entirely on its own, no longer dependent on cartel protection or cartel permission to survive. The only thing left standing between Gus and true independence was the cartel itself, the same organization that had killed the man he loved and told him 20 years earlier to know his place and stay there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything Gus built during those years was preparation for a moment he had been waiting patiently to create. A moment when the empire hidden inside his chicken restaurants would finally be strong enough to stand completely on its own, with no need for Eladio's blessing or Eladio's protection ever again. But building that empire quietly was only half the job. The other half would require something far more dangerous than construction and business deals, because eventually, the men who had killed Max would need to be dealt with directly, and that reckoning would begin with a decision Gus made about someone much closer to home, someone working right beside him in the very operation he had spent so many years building in secret. Section 6. The Box Cutter. By the time this moment in the story arrives, Gus had already spent decades building something enormous out of almost nothing. He had turned a small restaurant into a chain of 14 locations. He had built a hidden lab capable of producing meth on an industrial scale. He had recruited exactly the right people to keep his secret safe, one careful decision at a time. All of that patience, all of that discipline, gets tested in a single scene that many people consider the most memorable moment of the entire show. A scene where Gus says almost nothing at all, and still manages to terrify everyone watching. To understand why this moment matters so much, you have to understand what led up to it. Walter White and his partner Jesse Pinkman had been working underneath Gus, cooking meth as part of his operation. At the same time, Gus had also brought in another chemist, named Gail Boetticher, a talented young man who Gus had personally sponsored through school years earlier. Gail was skilled enough that Gus began seriously considering whether he even needed Walter anymore. If Gail could learn the exact formula Walter used to make his product, then Walter and Jesse would no longer be necessary, and two men who already knew far too much about Gus's operation could be quietly removed without risking the business itself. Walter understood exactly what that meant for him and Jesse. If Gail finished learning the formula, both of their lives were in serious danger. So Walter made a decision that would change everything. He arranged for Jesse to kill Gail before Gail could ever finish learning what he needed to learn. Jesse went to Gail's apartment and shot him, ending any chance that Gail could replace Walter and Jesse in Gus's operation. It was a desperate move, made to protect their own lives, but it also meant openly defying and outsmarting one of the most dangerous men either of them had ever worked for. Gus's men were sent to check on the situation almost immediately. One of them, a longtime enforcer named Victor, arrived at Gail's apartment moments too late to stop what had already happened. He found Gail dead, with neighbors already gathering outside after hearing what had happened, some of them likely already calling the police. Victor made a decision in that moment that would end up costing him everything. Rather than staying calm and unnoticed, he rushed into the building to confirm what he was seeing, then rushed back out just as quickly, in full view of several neighbors who were now watching closely. He left his own car behind at the scene entirely, choosing instead to find Jesse nearby and force him, at gunpoint, to drive back to the lab together. Being seen so clearly, in a situation already surrounded by police attention, was exactly the kind of mistake that Gus's entire operation depended on avoiding. Once Victor and Jesse arrived back at the lab, another of Gus's key people, Mike Ehrmantraut, was waiting there as well, holding Walter and Jesse until Gus could decide what to do next. While everyone waited nervously for Gus to arrive, Victor did something that, on its own, might have seemed harmless, but which ends up playing a small role in how the next few minutes unfold. Realizing his own position within the operation might now be at risk because of what happened at Gail's apartment, Victor tried to prove his own value by attempting to cook a batch of meth himself, using what he had picked up simply from watching Walter work over time. It was his way of showing that he, too, understood the process, that he could be useful even without Walter and Jesse if it came down to it. When Gus finally arrived at the lab, everyone in the room expected the worst. Walter and Jesse had just openly defied him by killing the very person Gus had been grooming to replace them. Logic suggests that Gus would want them dead immediately, as a clear and simple punishment for stepping so far out of line. Walter, sensing exactly how much danger they were both in, tried desperately to talk his way out of the situation, explaining himself, trying to justify what had happened, doing everything he could to remind Gus why keeping them alive still made business sense. Gus said almost nothing in response. He simply stood there, calm, quiet, and completely unreadable, while Walter's nervous explanation filled the silence around him. What happened next is the part of this scene that people remember most vividly. Gus put on a protective suit, the kind used to avoid getting contaminated during chemical work, and picked up a simple box cutter, the kind of small blade tool normally used to open cardboard boxes. Everyone in the room, including the audience watching at home for the first time, assumed this was the moment Gus was finally going to kill Walter and Jesse himself, using this tool as a way to make the punishment feel even more personal and controlled. Instead, without a single word of explanation, Gus turned to Victor and slit his throat instead, killing his own longtime employee right there in front of everyone, while keeping his eyes locked directly on Walter the entire time it happened. There was no shouting. There was no speech explaining why this was happening. Gus simply did it, calmly, deliberately, and then, once Victor's body dropped to the floor, he removed the protective suit, cleaned himself up, and said only a handful of words to the stunned cooks still standing there in shock. He told them, in effect, to get back to work, and then he walked back upstairs, leaving Walter and Jesse to deal with disposing of Victor's body themselves. It helps to slow down and really think about why Gus chose to kill Victor instead of Walter and Jesse in that moment, because the reasoning behind it tells you almost everything about how Gus thinks. Walter and Jesse were still, at that point, the only people who fully understood the exact formula for the specific product Gus's business depended on. Killing them immediately, no matter how angry Gus may have felt about what they had just done, would have meant destroying the most valuable part of his own operation out of simple frustration. Gus never let frustration control his decisions. Even in a moment where two men had just directly defied him by killing someone he had personally sponsored and was grooming for years, Gus still made the choice that protected his business over the choice that simply satisfied his anger. At the same time, Gus could not simply let what Walter and Jesse had done go unanswered either. Allowing that kind of defiance to pass without any consequence at all would have sent an even more dangerous message to everyone working underneath him, suggesting that his authority could be challenged without any real cost. So instead of punishing Walter and Jesse directly, Gus chose to punish someone else entirely, someone who actually had made a mistake of his own that day by being seen so clearly at Gail's apartment. Victor's mistake gave Gus exactly the excuse he needed to demonstrate the full weight of his authority without touching the two people he still needed alive. It solved two problems at once. It removed someone who had genuinely put the operation at risk through carelessness, and it sent an unmistakable warning to Walter and Jesse about exactly what kind of man they were now working for. Giancarlo Esposito, the actor who played Gus, has spoken openly about how difficult this particular scene was for him personally, and his comments help explain just how seriously the show approached this single moment. He has said that the first time he read the script for this scene, he was shocked enough that he had to put the pages down and step away before he could continue. He talked about needing to work through his own discomfort with what he was being asked to portray, eventually finding a way to justify Gus's actions in his own mind by focusing on the idea that killing Victor was, in Gus's twisted logic, a way of protecting everyone else working for him, by making the consequences of carelessness absolutely clear. Even with that understanding in place, Esposito has described the actual filming of the scene as a difficult experience, one that took place over 2 full days of shooting, during which he remained largely silent and focused, rarely speaking with anyone else on set, while preparing for what he had to do. There is a small but telling detail from behind the scenes that shows just how much thought went into making this moment feel exactly right. Esposito has mentioned that the boots he was originally given to wear for the scene were too large for him, and he worried that if he slipped or stumbled at all during filming, it would completely break the character in that moment, since Gus is someone who never loses his physical composure, even while doing something as violent as this. That level of concern over something as small as footwear shows how carefully the performance was built around maintaining total control at every single second, because even a small physical stumble would have undercut everything the scene was trying to communicate about who Gus really is. Other people involved in making the show have talked about this scene as well, and their comments help explain why it became such a defining moment for the character. Bryan Cranston, who played Walter, said he was not expecting the story to take this particular direction when he first read the script, and he described the scene as painful to watch, but also beautifully put together. He specifically pointed out the contrast between Gus's total stillness throughout the entire scene, and Walter's nervous, desperate attempts to talk his way out of danger, describing his own character's behavior in that moment as essentially trying to survive through sheer nervous energy, while Gus barely moved or reacted at all. Cranston also commented on how effective Esposito's performance was, simply through his eyes, saying that when Esposito plays this darker side of Gus, his eyes seem to go completely dead, and that alone is enough to make the danger in the room feel real, without a single word needing to be spoken. The person who created the show and wrote this particular episode later revealed something interesting about how little direction Esposito actually needed to deliver this performance. Even though every action in the scene was written out clearly in the script, very little conversation happened between the writer and the actor about exactly how Esposito should approach playing this moment. Esposito was largely left to interpret the emotional reality of what Gus was doing on his own, and the result speaks for itself. The scene works as well as it does, specifically because Esposito understood something about the character that did not need to be spelled out for him. He knew that the true horror of this moment came not from anger or theater, but from total, practiced calm. It is worth thinking carefully about what this scene reveals, about how Gus operates, compared to almost every other dangerous figure in this story. A lot of intimidating characters rely on loud displays of anger, threats, or violence, delivered with visible rage. Gus never needed any of that. In this entire scene, he barely speaks more than a handful of words total. He does not raise his voice. He does not explain his reasoning out loud to anyone in the room. He simply acts, decisively and without hesitation, and then returns to his normal, composed self almost immediately afterward, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. That contrast between the extreme violence of what he just did and the total normalcy of how he behaves the very next moment is exactly what makes the scene so unsettling. Most people, even people capable of real violence, show some kind of emotional reaction afterward. some sign that what just happened affected them in some way. Gus shows nothing. He puts his suit back on the rack, so to speak, and moves on with his day, leaving Walter and Jesse to clean up both the physical mess and the psychological aftermath entirely on their own. This scene also does something important for how the story develops going forward, beyond just being a shocking moment on its own. It permanently changes the relationship between Gus and Walter for the rest of their time working together. Before this scene, Walter may have believed he had more room to make his own decisions, more ability to push back against Gus's authority when it suited his own interests. After watching Gus kill someone else entirely, calmly and without hesitation, purely to make a point, Walter understood exactly how far Gus was willing to go, and exactly how little patience remained for any further defiance. Every decision Walter makes involving Gus from this point forward carries the memory of this scene underneath it, whether the show says so directly or not. It also says something important about Victor himself, and about the risks that come with working for a man like Gus. Victor had been a loyal enforcer for years, someone who had clearly earned enough trust to be given serious responsibility within the operation. None of that loyalty or history protected him once he made a mistake serious enough to threaten the entire operation's safety. Being seen at the scene of Gale's murder, leaving his own vehicle behind, and being spotted by multiple witnesses were not small errors in an operation built entirely around secrecy and control. Gus's response makes clear that in his world, loyalty and history matter far less than the discipline required to avoid exposing the operation to unnecessary risk. Even his most trusted people were never fully safe from the consequences of a serious mistake. There is one more detail worth mentioning about how this scene has been remembered since it first aired. Esposito himself has said in interviews that this particular scene remains one of his personal favorites from the entire show, largely because of how much it allowed him to communicate through silence rather than dialogue. He has compared the feeling of the scene to certain styles of theater, built around long pauses and physical stillness, rather than constant talking, explaining that the almost complete absence of speech throughout most of the scene forced every ounce of tension to come through behavior and expression alone. That approach fits perfectly with everything else we already know about how Gus operates in every other part of his life. He built an entire criminal empire without ever needing to shout, threaten loudly, or explain himself to people who worked for him. This scene simply shows that same quality taken to its most extreme and terrifying possible expression. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That threat did not come from the DEA, and it did not come from Walter White. It came from inside the Salamanca family itself, a younger, sharper cousin of Hector, who had none of Tuco's temper and none of Hector's age working against him. He would spend years quietly pulling at every loose thread in Gus's carefully built world, and he would get closer to the truth than anyone ever had before. Section 7. The Superlab and the Cost of Secrecy. Every empire needs a place to actually make the product that keeps it running. For years, Gus had been buying, packaging, and moving meth through his restaurant network, but at some point, his ambitions grew larger than what he could produce through smaller means. He wanted a facility built entirely from scratch, hidden so completely that no one, not the cartel, not the police, not even most of his own employees, would ever know it existed. Building that facility would end up costing more than money. It would cost the life of a man who never even understood what he was truly building. The idea for a large-scale lab did not originate with Gus himself. It came from Lydia Rodarte Quayle, the logistics expert, connected to Madrigal Electromotive, who had already been helping Gus move product safely across long distances. Lydia proposed the idea of a lab capable of producing meth on an industrial level, something far beyond what a small operation tucked away in the back of a building could manage. Gus took the idea seriously enough to move forward with it, and together with his business partner Peter Schuler, he financed the project, which ended up costing more than $8 million by the time it was finished. That number alone tells you how seriously Gus treated this decision. He was not testing out a small experiment. He was investing an enormous amount of money into something meant to become the permanent foundation of his entire operation going forward. The location chosen for this project mattered just as much as the lab itself. Gus decided to build it underground, hidden beneath an industrial laundry business he already owned, called Lavanderia Brillante. That building already had a legitimate purpose, cleaning large amounts of linens and uniforms for hotels and other businesses around the city, which meant trucks coming and going, workers moving in and out, and heavy use of water and electricity were all completely normal parts of daily operations there already. Building something secret underneath a business that already had a reasonable excuse for unusual activity made the entire project far easier to hide than if he had tried to build somewhere with no natural explanation for what people might notice happening on the surface. To actually build something this complicated in total secrecy, Gus needed skilled workers who understood how to dig out a large hidden space underneath an existing building without anyone outside ever noticing what was happening. He brought in a team of engineers from Germany to handle the job, led by a man named Werner Ziegler. Werner was an experienced engineer whose own father had worked on major construction projects overseas, including helping build one of the most famous buildings in the world, the Sydney Opera House. Werner clearly came from a background of serious, disciplined construction work, and Gus trusted him enough to hand him one of the most important secrets his entire operation depended on. Managing a project this sensitive required someone Gus trusted completely to oversee the day-to-day details, and that responsibility fell to Mike Ehrmantraut. Mike had already proven himself reliable in earlier parts of Gus's operation, and by this point, he had become one of the people Gus relied on most for anything requiring careful, disciplined handling. Mike was placed in charge of supervising the construction site, managing the workers, and making sure nothing about the project ever leaked out to anyone who could use that information against Gus. The construction itself required extreme secrecy at every single stage. Werner and his crew were kept isolated during the entire project, housed away from the public in living quarters connected to the worksite itself, so they would have no reason to interact with anyone outside the project who might accidentally learn something they should not. This meant the workers were essentially cut off from their normal lives for long stretches of time, unable to see friends or family, unable to leave whenever they wanted, all in service of protecting a secret none of them had asked to be pulled into so completely. At one point during construction, the crew needed to blast through a large section of rock blocking the area where an elevator shaft needed to go. That blast had to be carefully timed and disguised, and it was masked by arranging for a truck to strike some metal sheeting above ground at the same exact moment, so that anyone nearby who heard the noise would assume it came from something completely ordinary happening on the surface. Werner Ziegler comes across, through everything the story shows about him, as a genuinely decent man who simply did not fully understand the seriousness of what he had gotten involved in. He treated the project largely like any other difficult construction job, focused on solving engineering problems and getting the work done well, without seeming to fully grasp that a single mistake on a project like this could cost him his life. Mike, who understood exactly how dangerous Gus's world could be, tried at times to subtly warn Werner about the seriousness of what they were doing. But Werner's focus remained mostly on doing good work and getting through the isolation of the job so he could eventually go home. That isolation eventually became too much for Werner to bear silently. He had been married to his wife, Margaretha, for 26 years at that point, and the two of them had never spent months apart from each other before this project. The loneliness of being separated from her for so long, combined with the strict secrecy of the job, wore him down over time. At one point, while out with some of his crew, Werner let slip small details about the secret project to a stranger while drinking, a slip that Mike had to address directly, warning him again about how seriously Gus took secrecy, and reminding him to think carefully about the real nature of the work he was doing. Despite that warning, Werner's homesickness only grew worse. He asked Mike directly if he could visit his wife, even just for a short trip, and Mike refused, though he did allow Werner to at least speak with her by phone. That small compromise was not enough. The next day, Werner made the decision to escape from the secured living quarters entirely. He disabled the security cameras using a laser pointer, a surprisingly simple trick that worked because of the older-style cameras being used at the site, and made his way out to arrange a meeting with his wife nearby. Mike immediately began tracking Werner down once his escape was discovered, understanding exactly how dangerous this situation had become. While searching for him, something happened that made the entire situation far worse than a simple case of a homesick engineer wandering off. A man named Lalo Salamanca, a sharp and dangerous member of the Salamanca family, who had already begun quietly investigating Gus's operations, managed to reach Werner by phone, pretending to be one of Gus's own men. Believing he was speaking to someone he could trust, Werner revealed some details about the construction project to Lalo before Mike managed to find him and end the call. Mike eventually located Werner at a hotel where he had gone to meet his wife, and he brought the situation to an end there. What Mike said to Werner in that moment mattered enormously, because Mike still cared, in his own way, about treating Werner with some measure of respect, even knowing what almost certainly had to happen next, given how serious this security breach had become. Mike made sure Werner's wife would be sent home safely, away from any danger connected to what was about to happen, and Werner cooperated with that plan, without ever fully understanding what he was actually agreeing to. Gus, once informed of everything that had happened, including the fact that Lalo now had information about the project directly from Werner himself, made his decision quickly and without hesitation. Werner could no longer be trusted, and the risk of keeping him alive, now that Lalo was actively investigating the project, was too great to accept. Gus ordered Mike to kill him. Mike tried to argue against this decision, hoping there might be another way to handle the situation without taking Werner's life. Gus refused to consider any alternative. The decision stood, and Mike, despite everything in him resisting the idea, ultimately carried it out himself, rather than allowing someone else to do it. He took Werner out into the desert, away from the rest of the crew, and prepared to end his life there. In one of the quieter, more haunting moments of the entire story, Werner, understanding by then exactly what was about to happen, held no anger or resentment toward Mike for what he was about to do. Instead, he commented on how many stars were visible out there in the open desert night, far from any city lights, and asked to take one last walk to look at them more closely before anything happened. Mike allowed him that moment, and then, as Werner walked quietly under that open sky, Mike shot him from behind. The aftermath of Werner's death reveals just as much about how carefully Gus manages every consequence of his decisions as the killing itself does. Werner's wife was told a version of events that made his death look like a simple, tragic accident during construction work, and she was given money as compensation for her loss. Werner's crew, the men who had worked beside him for months and clearly respected him, were sent home and instructed to keep quiet about everything they had seen. A funeral was held for him back in Germany, and his co-workers, wanting to honor him in some way, put together a tribute gift for his widow, a slide rule, a tool connected to his engineering work, carefully preserved inside a clear block for display. That gift, meant as a simple gesture of respect from men who had genuinely cared about their crew leader, would later become an important clue in Lalo's ongoing investigation into exactly what Gus had really been building. There is a small but telling moment that happened among Werner's crew after his death that says something important about how different people processed what had happened. One of the workers, a man named Kai, spoke somewhat dismissively about Werner while receiving paperwork related to his death, calling him a good man but soft, suggesting that his death, in some sense, had been a necessary consequence of the mistakes he made. Mike, who was still clearly carrying real guilt over what he had been ordered to do, reacted to this comment with anger, striking Kai in response. Another worker on the crew, a man named Casper, later remarked that Werner had been worth far more than Mike, a comment Mike did not argue against or defend himself from. That silence says something important. Even Mike himself seemed to recognize that what happened to Werner was not something that could be fully justified, no matter how necessary Gus considered it for protecting the operation. The emotional toll of what happened stayed with Mike long after the immediate crisis passed. Disgusted with himself over what he had been forced to do, and troubled by how little value Gus seemed to place on a man who had never actually done anything malicious, only made an understandable human mistake driven by loneliness, Mike walked away from working for Gus entirely for a period of time. He fell into a serious depression and began drinking heavily, struggling with the weight of what he had done. It eventually took real effort and a different kind of motivation, tied to his own long-running desire for revenge against people connected to the Salamanca family, to bring him back into Gus's operation again. Gus's reaction to all of this stands in sharp contrast to Mike's. Where Mike carried visible guilt over Werner's death, Gus showed no comparable sign of struggle. Once the immediate danger was handled, construction on the lab was simply paused, while Lalo remained an active threat, and Gus moved on to managing the next problem in front of him. This difference between the two men matters, because it shows just how completely Gus had trained himself, over decades, to treat necessary losses as simple business decisions, rather than moments requiring any real emotional processing. Werner was not the first person to die, because his presence became inconvenient to Gus's larger plans, and he would not be the last. The story of Werner Ziegler did not end with his death either. Lalo, who had already gotten a partial version of the truth directly from Werner over the phone, refused to let the matter drop. He continued investigating what Werner had actually been building for months afterward, eventually tracking down Werner's widow, Margarethe, all the way in Germany. During that visit, Lalo found the very tribute slide rule that Werner's crew had sent her as a gift after his death, and using details connected to that object, he was eventually able to track down and interrogate Casper, one of the crew members who had worked closely with Werner, hoping to learn more about exactly what the true purpose of the construction project had really been. This single event, an ordinary engineer being killed for an entirely human mistake made out of loneliness, ended up becoming one of the most important threads pulling Lalo closer to the truth about Gus's entire operation. A tribute meant to honor a good man's memory became, without anyone intending it, a clue leading a dangerous enemy directly towards secrets Gus had spent years protecting. It is a strange kind of irony that an act of genuine kindness from Werner's grieving crew ended up creating exactly the kind of risk that Gus's entire operation was built to avoid. Looking at everything that happened to Werner as a whole, it becomes clear just how ruthless Gus's standard for loyalty really was. Werner was not a criminal. He was not dishonest, and he was not trying to work against Gus in any way. He was simply an ordinary, decent man, doing a difficult job under extremely isolating conditions, who eventually made a very human mistake, driven by nothing more than missing his wife after months of separation. That single mistake, born entirely out of loneliness rather than malice, was enough to end his life. The moment Gus decided the risk of keeping him alive had grown too large. Nothing about his years of good, careful work mattered once that risk existed. In Gus's world, intentions were never the deciding factor. Only outcomes mattered. And the outcome of Werner's mistake was a threat that had to be eliminated completely. Before we move on, If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same unforgiving standard, the idea that even good, loyal people become expendable the moment they create risk, would soon be tested again. This time not against a quiet engineer, caught in an impossible situation, but against the very man who had learned about the lab in the first place. A member of the Salamanca family sharp enough and patient enough to bring Gus closer to real danger than almost anyone else ever had. Section 8. Lalo Salamanca, the one man who almost won Gus, had spent 20 years outsmarting people who never truly understood the size of what they were dealing with. Hector was too consumed by old-world cartel pride to imagine a quiet restaurant owner could be his equal. Eladio was too confident in his own power to ever look closely at the man he had spared. Walter White, dangerous as he eventually became, was still an amateur playing catch-up against decades of careful planning. Then came a member of the Salamanca family who was different from all of them, a man named Lalo Salamanca. And for the first time in the entire story, Gus met someone who came close to beating him completely. Lalo was a cousin of Hector, but he shared almost none of Hector's personality. Hector ruled through fear, temper, and brute force, the kind of man who solved problems by intimidating people into submission. Lalo was something else entirely. He was calm, charming, endlessly patient, and dangerously intelligent. Someone who noticed small details other people missed and never let go of a question once it started bothering him. He had a warmth about him in social situations that made him easy to underestimate, right up until the moment his sharp mind started connecting pieces together that were never supposed to fit. Lalo's suspicion of Gus began building slowly, the same way almost everything in this story tends to build, through small inconsistencies rather than one dramatic reveal. At one point, a rumor began circulating that a rival group had been quietly stepping on, meaning cutting or altering, the cocaine that belonged to the Salamanca family's supply chain. Lalo decided to investigate this claim personally, rather than simply dismissing it. Along with Nacho Varga, a young man working inside the cartel's operations, Lalo drove out to a location where packets of cocaine connected to Gus's chicken farm were being stored before distribution. Inspecting the packets himself, Lalo determined that some of them were not actually the cartel's real product at all. That single discovery was enough for Lalo to demand a face-to-face meeting with Gus and Juan Bolsa, another senior cartel figure, to talk through what he had found. Gus, never one to panic, offered an explanation on the spot. He claimed that Werner Ziegler, the German engineer working on his secret construction project, had accidentally discovered part of Gus's real operation and had stolen product as a result, which was why some of the packets did not match what they should have. It was a lie built quickly, but built well enough to survive scrutiny in the moment, giving Gus a way to explain the discrepancy without revealing what Werner's project actually was. When Lalo pressed further, demanding to know exactly what construction project Werner had actually been hired for in the first place, Gus showed him and Bolsa a large structure being built, claiming it was nothing more than an industrial chiller meant to support his chicken business. It was during this same meeting that Lalo was formally introduced to Mike Ehrmantraut, the man quietly supervising the real project underneath that cover story. This meeting shows something important about how differently Lalo operated compared to everyone else who had crossed paths with Gus before him. Most people accepted Gus's explanations because his calm confidence made those explanations feel believable. Lalo accepted the explanation on the surface, but he never actually stopped thinking about it. Underneath his relaxed, friendly manner, he kept turning the details over in his mind, refusing to let the story settle into something he simply trusted without further proof. That refusal to let go of a lingering question, even after being given a reasonable enough answer, is exactly what eventually made him so dangerous to Gus. Around this same period, a serious escalation happened that pulled Lalo directly into a life-threatening situation involving Gus's operation. An innocent man named Fred Whalen, who worked at a travel agency with no real connection to any of this, ended up caught in the middle of the growing conflict between the Salamanca family and Gus. Fred was killed, and through careful maneuvering, Gus arranged, using Mike, to have Lalo implicated in that murder. This was a serious move on Gus's part, using the justice system itself as a weapon rather than relying purely on violence. Lalo ended up arrested and placed in jail because of this setup, effectively removing him from cartel leadership for a period of time and giving Gus room to keep expanding his own operations without Lalo actively investigating him during that stretch. Being locked away did not slow Lalo down the way Gus likely hoped it would. Even from jail, Lalo continued thinking carefully about the situation he had been placed in, and he eventually found a way out through legal means, using resources connected to Jimmy McGill, a lawyer tied to the Salamanca family's business dealings. Once free again, Lalo returned to his suspicions about Gus, with even more determination than before, now fully aware that Gus was capable of using the legal system itself as a weapon against his enemies, which only confirmed for Lalo that Gus was far more dangerous and far more calculating than most people in the cartel world gave him credit for being. The conflict between the two men eventually reached a point where Gus decided Lalo had become too dangerous to leave alive. An assassination attempt was arranged against Lalo at a compound where he was staying, an operation that involved Nacho Varga acting as an inside contact to let the assassins in without raising alarm. The plan called for the attackers to strike, with Nacho then making his own escape once the job was done. Things did not go according to plan. Lalo managed to detect the ambush and turned the tables on the assassins himself, killing them before they could complete their mission. For a while, many people, including members of the cartel, believed Lalo had actually died in that assassination attempt. He had not. He survived, and from that point forward, he understood with total certainty that Gus had tried to have him killed, which meant there was no longer any pretending at cooperation or trust between them. The gloves were completely off. From this point on, Lalo's investigation into Gus became far more focused and far more personal. He was no longer simply curious about strange inconsistencies in cocaine shipments. He was actively hunting for proof, something solid enough to bring back to the highest levels of the cartel that would expose Gus as a traitor working against them from the inside. This search eventually led Lalo back to the mystery of Werner Ziegler and the construction project that had never been fully explained. Lalo began digging deeper into who Werner really was and what he had actually been building before his death. That investigation eventually took Lalo all the way to Germany, where he tracked down Werner's widow, Margareta. During this visit, Lalo found the tribute gift that Werner's co-workers had sent her after his death, a slide rule preserved carefully inside a clear block, a small keepsake meant only as a gesture of respect for a man they had genuinely cared about. Using details connected to that object, Lalo managed to track down another member of Werner's crew, a worker named Casper, and interrogated him directly, trying to pull out whatever additional information Casper might know about what the construction project had truly been for. This entire trip shows something important about the kind of threat Lalo actually represented. He was not simply reacting emotionally to being betrayed or nearly killed. He was conducting a genuine, patient investigation, traveling across the world if necessary, following the smallest possible leads, refusing to give up, even when the trail seemed to lead nowhere useful at first. This was the same kind of discipline and patience that had defined Gus's own approach to building his empire for 20 years. In Lalo, Gus was finally facing an opponent who matched his own methodical nature, someone who would not be satisfied with a convincing lie the way almost everyone else in his life had been. Eventually, Lalo's suspicions grew strong enough that a direct and violent confrontation became unavoidable. Lalo made his way to Gus's industrial laundry building, the same location hiding the underground lab that Werner had died protecting the secret of. In the process of getting inside, Lalo ambushed and killed several of Gus's own bodyguards stationed there, along with another man working security at the location, cutting through Gus's protection with brutal efficiency in order to finally get close enough to confront him directly. This was not a subtle investigation anymore. This was Lalo making a direct move to either expose Gus once and for all, or kill him outright, before Gus could stop him first. What happened during that final confrontation between the two men shows exactly how dangerous this moment truly was for Gus. Despite everything Gus had built, despite every advantage his careful planning usually gave him, the two men ended up facing each other in the dark, in an incredibly tense and uncertain situation where either man could have easily been the one who did not survive. In the end, it was Gus who fired first in that darkness, shooting Lalo before Lalo could finish him off. Lalo did not die instantly from that shot. Instead, he choked on his own blood before finally dying there, in that building. The same building, holding the secret he had spent so much time and effort trying to uncover. His body was buried underneath the very foundation of the superlab he had been so determined to expose, sealed permanently into the same secret he had almost succeeded in revealing to the entire cartel. There is something worth sitting with in how close this outcome actually came to going the other way. Of every threat that ever challenged Gus across his entire story, Lalo is the one who came closest to actually winning. He survived an assassination attempt meant to kill him. He continued investigating, even after being framed for a murder and thrown in jail. He traveled internationally, tracked down witnesses, and pieced together enough of the truth to walk directly into Gus's most heavily guarded secret location, with the clear intention of ending things, once and for all. Had that final confrontation in the dark gone even slightly differently? Had Gus been a fraction slower to react? Or had Lalo managed to see him first in that darkness? The entire outcome of everything that happens afterward, all of it, could have ended completely differently. Gus's 20 years of careful patience, his entire empire, his eventual conflict with Walter White, none of it would have happened the same way if Lalo had won that fight instead. It also matters that Lalo's death, unlike so many of the deaths connected to Gus's operation, was not the result of some carefully engineered trap built over months of planning. It was, in a very real sense, closer to pure survival. Two dangerous men facing each other in the dark, each one trying to be the one who fired first. Gus is often shown throughout the story as someone who wins through preparation and patience rather than through raw physical danger. Against Lalo, for one of the only times in the entire story, Gus's victory came down to something closer to simple luck. A single shot fired in darkness that happened to land before Lalo's did. That detail alone shows how genuinely dangerous Lalo was as an opponent. Someone capable of pushing Gus into a situation where careful planning alone was no longer enough to guarantee the outcome. Following Lalo's death, Gus wasted no time returning his attention to the project Lalo's investigation had forced him to pause. He immediately ordered Mike to find a new engineer and a new construction crew, instructing him to resume work on the superlab right away. This detail says something important about how Gus processed even a threat as serious as Lalo turned out to be. Once the danger was gone, Gus did not pause to reflect on how close he had come to losing everything. He simply moved forward, treating the resumption of his construction project as the next necessary step, the same way he had treated every other setback throughout his 20 years of careful planning. Even surviving the most dangerous confrontation of his entire life did not slow him down for long. Looking back at everything Lalo represented, it becomes clear why his part of this story matters so much to understanding exactly how impressive Gus's overall success really was. It is one thing to outsmart people who never fully appreciate the danger they are dealing with. people like Hector, blinded by old-fashioned pride, or Eladio, blinded by overconfidence in his own untouchable position. It is a very different thing to survive an opponent who matches your own patience, your own intelligence, and your own willingness to wait as long as necessary to get the answers you need. Lalo Salamanca was that opponent, and the fact that Gus barely survived their final confrontation shows just how real that danger truly was, even for a man who had spent 2 decades building himself into someone almost nobody could successfully challenge. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That man was Walter White, a chemistry teacher Gus had once judged too reckless and too unpredictable to fully trust. Gus brought him in anyway, because his product was simply too good to ignore, and for a long stretch of time, that decision paid off exactly the way Gus expected. What Gus never accounted for was how much Walter would eventually come to want the very thing Gus had spent 20 years protecting for himself. Section 9. Face-Off. The Death of the Untouchable Man. For years, Walter White had been trying to find a way out from under Gus Fring's control, and for years, every attempt had failed. Gus was too careful, too well protected, and too many steps ahead of anyone trying to move against him. But Walter was not the kind of man who gave up simply because the odds were against him, and eventually, he found the one weakness Gus had never fully managed to protect, a weakness built from 20 years of hatred that had never once cooled down. Before reaching that final plan, Walter had already tried once to kill Gus directly, using a bomb hidden in Gus's own car. That attempt failed. Gus, sensing something was wrong, avoided getting into the vehicle, leaving Walter to scramble afterward, removing the bomb himself before anyone discovered it and traced the attempt back to him. That failure meant Walter needed an entirely different approach, something that did not depend on catching Gus off guard through simple mechanical tricks. He needed a plan that used something about Gus himself, some part of his character that could be turned against him. The answer came from thinking carefully about the two men who despised each other more than anyone else involved in this entire story, Gus and Hector Salamanca. By this point in the story, Hector was an old man, confined to a wheelchair, unable to speak after suffering a serious stroke years earlier, forced to communicate only by ringing a small bell attached to his chair or by spelling out words letter by letter on a board in front of him. Gus visited Hector regularly at the retirement home where he lived, not out of any kindness, but as a form of quiet, ongoing cruelty. Gus would come simply to look at him, to remind Hector, without ever needing to say much, exactly who had won and exactly how powerless Hector had become. It was Gus's own private way of continuing the punishment that had started decades earlier at Eladio's pool, back when Hector had personally killed Max and told Gus to know his place. Walter understood that this relationship, built entirely on decades of hatred between the two of them, was something he could use. He went to see Hector directly and made him an offer. Walter pointed out that as much as Hector hated Walter for the death of his nephew, Tuco, Hector's hatred for Gus ran far deeper and had lasted far longer. Walter proposed a plan that would give Hector one final chance at revenge against the man who had spent years quietly tormenting him, and Hector, despite everything separating him and Walter, agreed to take part. The plan required patience and careful staging on both sides, a fitting irony, given how much of Gus's own life had been built on exactly that same kind of patience. Hector, following the plan, requested a meeting with agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration, giving the impression that he might be willing to become an informant. When Hank Schrader, the DEA agent investigating this entire world, came to meet with him, Hector gave him nothing useful at all. Instead, using his letterboard, Hector spelled out a crude insult directed at the agents in the room, refusing to cooperate in any real way. On the surface, this looked like an old man wasting everyone's time out of simple stubbornness. In reality, it was exactly the show Walter and Hector needed to put on. Because word of Hector's visit to the DEA reached Tyrus Kitt, one of Gus's men, who reported it directly back to Gus. Gus, hearing that Hector had gone to speak with federal agents, immediately assumed the worst, believing Hector might actually be turning informant after all these years. This was a serious threat to everything Gus had built, and Gus responded the way he always did when a threat needed to be handled personally rather than delegated to someone else. He decided to deal with Hector himself, planning to visit him quietly and end the problem permanently before it could grow into something more dangerous. Before Gus arrived at the retirement home, Tyrus was sent ahead to sweep Hector's room for any hidden bugs or cameras, making sure Hector was not secretly recording anything that could be used against Gus later. Walter, aware this security check would happen, waited outside the building during that sweep, using the short window of time after Tyrus finished and left to plant a bomb underneath Hector's wheelchair, hidden well enough that Tyrus's earlier check had already been completed and would not happen again before Gus arrived. When Gus finally entered Hector's room, he came prepared to finish things the same calm, controlled way he handled almost every serious threat in his life. He brought a syringe filled with poison, intending to kill Hector quietly and without any mess, the kind of clean, private death that would raise no suspicion once discovered. Before carrying this out, Gus spoke to Hector directly, mocking him one final time. He asked what kind of man goes to the DEA at all, answering his own question by calling Hector a crippled little rat and asking whether that was truly how Hector wanted to be remembered at the end of his life. Then, in a moment meant to be one final act of cruelty, Gus told Hector this was his last chance to look at him. For years, during Gus's visits, Hector had refused to give him even that small satisfaction, always looking away rather than meeting Gus's eyes directly. This time, something changed. Hector looked up and met Gus's gaze directly for the first time in a very long while. At first, his expression showed something closer to sadness or regret. Then, almost instantly, that expression shifted into pure hatred, the kind of look that comes from someone who has finally reached the end of years of quiet suffering and humiliation. Gus, for a brief moment, seemed genuinely caught off guard by that sudden change, unsure exactly what it meant. He did not have time to figure it out. Hector began ringing his bell, not once, but repeatedly, and at first, both Gus and Tyrus seemed confused by why he would suddenly start doing that in the middle of this moment. Then Gus realized, almost too late, that the bell was never simply a way for Hector to communicate. It was the trigger for the bomb Walter had planted underneath the wheelchair earlier that day. The explosion that followed tore through the room instantly. It killed Hector and Tyrus immediately, ending both of their lives in a single violent moment. Gus, standing closer to the doorway when the blast went off, survived the initial explosion itself, though survived is a strange word to use for what happened to him. He managed to walk out of the destroyed room into the hallway outside, and for a brief, strange moment, it looked almost like he had escaped the explosion completely unharmed, calm and composed exactly the way he always was. He even paused to adjust his tie, straightening it with the same careful attention to detail that had defined every part of his public appearance for decades. Then the camera shifted to reveal the other side of his face, and the illusion of Gus walking away unharmed shattered completely. Half of his face had been destroyed by the blast, horrifically injured in a way that left absolutely no possibility of survival. Having straightened his tie one final time, Gus simply dropped to the floor and died right there in the hallway, in front of the horrified staff of the retirement home, who had come running toward the sound of the explosion, having no idea what they were about to witness. There is something worth sitting with in exactly how that final moment was constructed, both for what it means about the character and for what it took to actually create on screen. The choice to have Gus walk out and adjust his tie before revealing the true extent of his injuries was not simply about shock value. It was one final, perfect expression of exactly who Gus had always been throughout the entire story. Even in his last living moment, mortally wounded beyond any hope of survival, his very last instinct was not fear, not panic, not any visible loss of control. It was to fix his tie, to maintain, for one final second, the same composed, dignified appearance he had spent his entire adult life presenting to the world. The man who built an empire on total self-control could not stop performing that same self-control even in the last seconds of his own life. The person who wrote and directed this particular episode, the creator of the entire show, has spoken about how difficult this scene actually was to film properly. He revealed that capturing Gus's final moments took 19 separate takes to get right, explaining that he felt genuinely uncomfortable and on edge during that day of filming, given how important it was for this moment to feel completely smooth and uninterrupted rather than choppy or rushed. Getting a scene like this right required precise timing between Giancarlo Esposito's physical performance and the visual effects work needed to reveal his injuries convincingly, and that combination proved far more difficult to execute cleanly than it might appear once finished on screen. The visual effect itself required months of preparation before filming ever began. Special effects artists worked extensively on designing exactly how Gus's injuries should look, eventually combining detailed prosthetic makeup applied directly to Esposito's face, with computer-generated imagery added afterward, blending two separate camera shots together during editing to create the final image audiences actually saw. Even the team responsible for creating zombie makeup on another well-known television show contributed expertise to help design this particular effect, showing just how much technical care went into making sure this single moment landed with the impact it was clearly meant to have. There is also a strange, almost eerie detail connected to where the inspiration for this scene actually came from. The show's creator has said that this sequence was partly inspired by a real historical event involving a scientist named Jack Parsons, a man known for his work with explosives who died after being severely injured in an accident on a film set, suffering serious injuries to his face that left a visible hole, and who reportedly survived for several minutes afterward, able to communicate briefly with people who arrived to help him before he ultimately died from his injuries. That a moment this shocking on screen traces back, even partially, to something that actually happened to a real person adds an unsettling layer of realism to a scene that already felt almost impossible to watch the first time it aired. It is worth thinking carefully about what this death actually represents for everything Gus had built across his entire life. This was a man who had survived Eladio's cartel for 20 years through pure patience. He had survived Hector's decades of hatred without ever losing control. He had survived Lalo Salamanca, the single most dangerous investigator he had ever faced, in a confrontation that could easily have gone the other way. He had built an empire so carefully protected that federal agents spent years unable to connect him to anything illegal at all. And in the end, none of that careful planning was what killed him. He was killed by the one relationship he never fully accounted for, the deep, unresolved hatred between himself and Hector, a hatred Gus had spent years personally nurturing through his own cruel visits, never once considering that this same relationship could eventually be turned into a weapon aimed directly back at him. That detail matters enormously when you think about how the story chooses to end his life. Gus was killed not by some clever trap built by Walter alone, and not by some sudden failure of his own careful planning. He was killed, in large part, by his own habit of returning again and again to torment a man he had already completely defeated, purely because that cruelty gave him some private satisfaction after everything Hector had taken from him decades earlier. Walter simply recognized that habit and understood exactly how to use it. The very cruelty that made Gus feel like he still held power over Hector, even after crushing the entire Salamanca family, ended up being the single crack in his armor that finally brought him down. There is a strange kind of symmetry in how this story closes as well, one worth noticing carefully. Gus's entire journey toward power began the day he watched Hector kill Max at that pool in Mexico, an act of violence that reshaped the rest of his life completely. His story ends the exact same way it began, with violence connected directly back to Hector. Only this time, Hector is the one delivering the final blow instead of simply watching one happen. The man who told Gus decades earlier to stick to chicken and know his place ended up being the very instrument of Gus's death at the very end of everything Gus had built in response to that humiliation. 20 years of patience, 20 years of careful revenge, finally completed against Eladio's entire organization. All of it still could not fully escape the shadow of that one relationship from the very beginning of his story. News of the explosion reached Walter almost immediately afterward. He was sitting in a rental car near an airport at the time, listening quietly to the radio, when a breaking news report came through, announcing that 3 people had died in an explosion at the retirement home. Walter's reaction to hearing that news was simple and quiet. He smiled, and then he drove away. There was no dramatic celebration, no outward display of triumph, just a small, private moment of satisfaction from a man who understood exactly what that explosion meant for his own future. Later, speaking briefly with his wife Skylar, who had heard about the explosion through the news and was asking him directly whether he had caused it, Walter answered her question with 2 simple words: "I won." Those 2 words carry an enormous amount of weight, given everything that came before them. Gus Fring had spent 20 years building an empire that survived cartel leadership, survived relentless investigation, and survived every attempt made against him by men far more experienced in this violent world than Walter White ever was. In the end, it took a high school chemistry teacher, someone Gus himself had once judged as too reckless and unpredictable to fully trust, to finally find the single weakness Gus had never managed to fully protect. Walter did not defeat Gus through greater skill in the drug business, and he did not defeat him through greater patience, since nobody in this entire story could match Gus's patience. He defeated him by understanding something deeply personal about Gus, a wound decades old that had never actually healed, and finding a way to make that wound fatal. With Gus's death, everything he had spent his life building began collapsing almost immediately. The careful, hidden operation that had survived undetected for 20 years, protected by restaurants, laundry trucks, corporate connections, and years of community trust, unraveled quickly once the man holding every piece of it together was suddenly gone. An empire built entirely around one person's patience and control cannot easily survive that person's sudden death, no matter how well constructed the physical pieces of it might still be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything that Gus had ever built, every year of patience, every careful decision, every quiet act of cruelty and control, comes down, in the end, to this single explosive moment in a retirement home hallway. A man calmly straightening his tie one last time before collapsing, having been beaten not by an equal in skill or in patience, but by the one enemy he never stopped needing to personally punish, right up until that same need finally cost him everything. Section 10. The Critical Verdict. By the time the story of Gus Fring came to its end, something had already been decided outside the world of the show itself. Critics, magazines, and award organizations had spent years watching this character develop, and nearly all of them arrived at the same conclusion. This was not simply a well-written villain. This was one of the best villains television had ever produced, and the record of awards, rankings, and critical praise built up around the character backs that claim up with real evidence, rather than simple opinion. Start with the awards given directly to Giancarlo Esposito, the actor who brought Gus to life across both shows. Esposito won the Critics' Choice Television Award for Best Supporting Actor in a Drama Series for his work playing Gus, and he won that same award a second time later on for his continued performance as the character. Alongside those wins, he also received 3 separate nominations for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Drama Series, spread across his years playing this role in both series. 3 nominations from one of the most respected award organizations in television is not something handed out casually. It reflects sustained, high-level recognition from an industry that watched this performance develop over multiple years and kept coming back to reward it. The character also received individual recognition, completely separate from any awards given to the actor playing him. Paste magazine placed Gus at number 3 on their list, ranking the 20 best television characters of that year. A notable achievement, considering how many strong characters existed across all of television during that same period. TV Guide later included him on their list of the 60 nastiest villains in television history, ranking him at number 3 on that list as well. Rolling Stone magazine included him among their ranking of the 40 greatest television villains of all time, in a separate list published a few years after that. These are not small, obscure rankings put together casually. These come from established entertainment publications, with long histories of covering television seriously, and each one arrived independently at the same basic conclusion, that Gus belonged near the very top of any conversation about the best villains ever created for the screen. Later critical writing about the character only reinforced this same idea further. One widely cited piece of film and television criticism describes Gus as generally agreed to be the best antagonist of modern television history, going on to explain that his effectiveness comes specifically from how similar he is to his eventual rival, Walter White. Both men share the same coldness, the same extreme discipline, and the same dangerous intelligence, and much of what makes their eventual conflict so compelling comes from watching 2 people built out of nearly identical traits eventually turn those same qualities against each other. This kind of praise is not limited to a single article or a single writer's opinion either. Multiple separate rankings of the greatest television villains across all genres and all decades consistently place Gus at or near the very top of their lists, frequently alongside other extremely well-regarded characters from shows like Game of Thrones or The Walking Dead. What stands out across nearly all of these comparisons is the specific reason critics give for ranking him so highly. It is rarely about how much violence he is capable of, since plenty of other television villains commit far more visible violence over the course of their own stories. Instead, critics consistently point to the same quality that this entire essay has been tracing from the very beginning: his complete stillness, his total self-control, and the unsettling contrast between his calm public appearance and the extreme danger hiding underneath it. One piece of writing focused specifically on ranking the best television villains describes exactly this quality in detail, explaining that what made Gus so frightening was never his outbursts, since he essentially never had any. The same writing points out that he could discuss something as serious as murder using the exact same calm tone he might use to take an order at his own restaurant, and that this complete lack of emotional reaction made him feel less like a typical dramatic villain and more like a natural force that simply could not be reasoned with or predicted through normal human logic. That description captures something important about why Gus continues to be discussed as one of the greatest villains ever written, years after the show itself ended. His fear factor never depended on shock or spectacle. It depended entirely on the unnerving idea that a man capable of such total violence could also appear so completely ordinary and reasonable in every other part of his life. It is worth remembering, looking back across everything covered in this essay, just how many different qualities had to come together to earn this level of consistent praise across so many different critics and publications over so many years. Section 1 showed how completely Gus disguised himself inside an ordinary, respected business, fooling federal investigators for 2 decades through nothing more than careful discipline and a spotless public image. Section 2 showed how the show refused to ever fully explain where he came from, creating a mystery that made him feel far more unsettling than a fully explained villain ever could. Section 3 and Section 4 together showed the painful origin of his patience, born from watching the person he loved murdered in front of him, and being forced to accept 20 years of forced cooperation with the very men responsible. Section 5 showed the enormous scale of what he built during those quiet years, an empire hidden so completely inside legitimate business operations that almost nobody ever noticed what was actually happening underneath. Section 6 showed exactly how far he was willing to go to protect that empire, killing a loyal employee without a single word of explanation, purely to send a message that needed to be understood clearly. Section 7 showed that same standard applied even to an innocent man who had done nothing wrong beyond making one very human mistake. Section 8 showed the one opponent who came closest to actually beating him, proving that even a man this careful could still be pushed to the very edge of survival. And Section 9 showed exactly how it all finally ended, not through some clever trap built by a smarter enemy, but through the one crack in his armor that even 20 years of discipline could never fully seal: his own need to keep punishing a man he had already completely defeated. Taken together, all of these pieces explain exactly why critics, award organizations, and entertainment publications have continued returning to this same character again and again over the years, consistently placing him at or near the top of nearly every serious conversation about the greatest villains television has ever produced. This was never simply a criminal who happened to be dangerous. This was a complete portrait of what total discipline looks like when it is placed entirely in service of something dark, built patiently over 20 years, protected through total emotional control, and ultimately undone, not by any weakness in his planning, but by the one piece of himself he could never fully master: his own need for personal revenge against the man who started it all. That combination, built carefully across 2 full television series and studied closely by critics and audiences alike, is exactly why Gus Fring continues to be remembered as one of the greatest villains ever put on screen. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.